Welcome to Cloudbreaking, Female Aviators of Illinois. This was a lot of fun to research. I learned a lot, not just about women aviators, but just aviation in general. Here's your fun random fact before we get started. There is a solar-powered airplane that flew in Switzerland. It is not very practical. It only flies about 40 miles an hour, and its wings are about 230 feet long to have enough solar cells to power the airplane enough to get it going. So there's your just random fun aviation fact before we get too deep into things. All right, so we're going to start with state of aviation at the early days. So the history of flight, it started with lighter than air ships. So hot air balloons, blimps, and gliders predate airplanes, which are labeled as heavier than air. I guess that kind of makes sense. It's easier to float than to fly as humans. We don't have wings yet. The first recorded human flight was in 1780 in a hot air balloon in France. It was two brothers, Joseph and Etienne Montgolfier, in 1783. They had a beautiful blue balloon that had all these beautiful patterns on it to represent Louis the 14th, I believe. I didn't write that part down. There were many other flights before that, but they were not humans. They sent a lot of animals up into the air to test the balloons and the safety of these things before they put humans in them. Elizabeth Thibley was the first woman to fly a hot air balloon. That was the next year in 1784. Jean Labrosse in 1798 was the first woman to solo in a hot air balloon. So women have been breaking records long before we even had airplanes. Before we had airplanes, we also had gliders. I came across a story of a man named George Cayley, who was this very wealthy man who was very interested in flight. And in 1853, he created a glider of one kind or another, and he was about to test it. And what he decided to do was not test it himself, but strap an unwilling servant to his glider and push him off a ledge. That doesn't sound very safe to me. The servant was naturally terrified. He did survive. I will say that. Everyone survived to tell the tale. But that's just, I guess, what you do when you have a lot of money and want to test your glider. Make sure you have yourself to test for future gliders. Of course, we all know 1903, the Wright brothers had the first plane flight at Kitty Hawk. It was very short. It did not last very long, but it was a breakthrough. It was a one-of-a-kind thing. So the Europeans did move a little faster on airplanes than Americans did. Women in Europe were flying much sooner than American women. Madame Therese Pettier was the first woman to solo in an airplane in 1908. She was the first one to fly. She was a sculptor. She had her fellow sculptor, Leon de la Grange, let her learn in his airplane. He taught her. She never earned a license, so she was an unlicensed pilot, but she did set records for the time. She did exhibitions. She was very popular. People liked to watch her fly. She did give up flying, though. When de la Grange was attempting a dangerous flight, he died in a plane crash, and she hung up her wings and never flew again. The first American woman to be in an airplane. She was a passenger, but the first American woman in an airplane was Edith Berg, who was the Wright brothers' business manager. So I guess it pays off to know the Wright brothers. She took this flight in 1908. And Baroness Raymond de la Roche was the first woman to receive a pilot's license in 1910. She was given the license by the Aero Club of France. I'm going to assume she was French and learned to fly there. Let's see. So we got some firsts here. There is some debate among the very first American woman to fly. I don't think there's much debate, but some historians argue over who was the first woman to fly. So pictured here is Blanche Stewart Scott. She was the first recorded woman to pilot an airplane on her own. Now, some naysayers will come in and say that her initial flight was actually an accident. So she was in the airplane by herself. She unblocked it and it started rolling and she lifted off and flew. She didn't get very high. She didn't get very far, but she did pilot the plane on her own. This was in 1910. There are people who say that her initial flight was an accident. I don't believe that. I believe she was determined to fly. I, of course, have no evidence to that, but I think people just wanted to discredit her for flying. The first flight that many people do recognize was by Bessica Reisch, and hers was seen as intentional. So Blanche flew in September and Bessica flew in October. So these two women were piloting initial flights very, very close to each other. Women were very interested in planes, especially in the early 1910s. Aviation was a huge deal. People came from all around to see it. People were very interested in it. It was new, it was novel. People were just very excited to see people fly. It was something incredible, very new. First American woman to receive her pilot's license was Harriet Quimby. She's pictured here in 1911. She was born in May 1875 in Michigan. She was initially a journalist. She wrote theater reviews. She was very popular. People loved reading her work. But one day she saw people flying at an exhibition and caught the bug. She wanted to know how to fly. So in 1911, she received her pilot's license. She earned license number 37 by the Aero Club of America, which was a branch of the Aero Club France. She was called the Dresden China Aviatrix, or China Doll, by the press. So she was kind of slight, very small, very pale, and the press really played up on the fact that she was this small, frail little woman, and she's piloting an airplane. Oh my gosh, look at this doll of a woman pilot an airplane. She was also known for wearing a plum silk or satin flight suit, which became very popular after she decided to wear it. It was seen as risque. My assumption is because it was pants rather than a skirt. I didn't find anybody pointing to specific aspects of her outfit, but I'm going to assume because she did wear flight pants rather than a skirt. She was also the first woman to fly over the English Channel. She was very groundbreaking for her time. She chose to have a career. She continued writing even after she gave up flying. She did continue to fly for a good portion of her life. No, she flew for her entire life. My apologies. I'm thinking of somebody else. She flew her entire life. She gave up marriage and husband, didn't want that at all, just decided to focus on her career as a writer and a pilot. She did exhibitions. She did races. She made her living off of her notoriety as a female pilot. Unfortunately, a year after she received her pilot's license, shortly after she flew across the English Channel, she was killed while after being thrown from her plane when it rolled over in an accident. So she was unfortunately killed in a plane accident, but I'm going to assume that was the way she wanted to go, in a plane. She loved flying. Here she is in the cockpit of her plane with one of her instructors in 1911. You can kind of see also her flight suit there. It was, of course, open cockpit. This was a slightly more advanced plane than the first one that the Wright brothers flew. Theirs was, you had to lie on your stomach and kind of like tilt your body back and forth to get things to even out, to get it to steer in any direction. This is when we've got some machinery on the inside that you can pilot a little easier than just like rolling back and forth. Many women, of course, were denied the opportunity to learn to fly because they were women. There was also a racial element to things. There were many African-American women who wanted to learn to fly, but were denied the opportunity. Some people went to Europe. Some just kept asking and wouldn't take no for an answer. Many went to France and earned their license over there. Many of them built their own airplanes. They bought their own airplanes. And they attended flight schools. There was one flight school that I'll get to in a little bit where the students had to build the plane because they didn't have the funds to purchase a pre-made plane. Lessons for flight often lasted a few months. And often these women were the only one in their class. They were in classes of men and they were the only ones who were women in their classes. They learned mechanics in these classes. A fair amount of women had a good or a decent interest in mechanics before they even started flying. They were interested in cars. When those came about, they were interested in farm machinery. They liked to tinker and they liked to know how their planes worked. Then they could also do necessary repairs to their own planes. A very common plane for early women to learn to fly on was the Curtis Jn4, which is pictured here. It was built for the military, to train the military. It cost $5,000, and after the military used the plane, they didn't need them anymore. They were sold, and they were sold at very low prices. You could get one for as low as $200, which back in the 1910s, the 1920s was a significant amount of money. It's still a significant chunk of change now. But all things considered, you could get a plane relatively easily in the early days of aviation. So once women had their planes, had their licenses, they would oftentimes try to make a living as pilots. Now, when airlines appeared, many airlines would not accept women as pilots for their airlines. They could be stewardesses, but they could not be pilots, which makes zero sense to me, but that was the logic of the time. So a lot of them made livings as stunt flyers, as barnstormers. They would go and do these aerial circuses. They would do these really dangerous stunts. They would travel across the country and just race and do tricks and just perform for crowds. Barnstorming grew really big in popularity in the 1920s. Racing was also a big one. Many pilots earned up to $1,500 per performance. That translated into today's money is about $44,000 per appearance. So they were making some decent money performing in these circuses. Of course, they're very dangerous. This is still early days of aviation. Planes were safe, but not the safest they could be. There's a fair amount of stories of people being thrown from planes or crashing their planes or attempting stunts that were too close to the ground. But they would do all kinds of tricks. They would do loops and barrel rolls and figure eights. They'd fly upside down. They'd walk on the wings. They'd hang from ropes suspended on the planes. Here's a picture. I couldn't find a woman doing it. So we have Jersey Ringle here. He's taking photos on the wings of his plane. I mean, they would try everything. There was a woman who was known as Princess Kicks a Hole in the Sky. She was well known for doing very dangerous stunts. She would fly upside down. She would do loops at high speeds. She did not care. She took all the risks and became quite a popular sensation to those who went to see her. They, of course, did lectures. A lot of women traveled around the country talking about their exploits as pilots, talking about their time in the air, talking about how great it is to fly, and encouraging women all across the country, women and girls, to join them in flying. And of course, there's transportation. They would transport not often passengers. You still needed a specific license to do passengers, but they would ferry things, ferry planes, ferry equipment across the country. Those were common jobs that they would do at the time. So while they couldn't work for airlines, they could work as instructors and trainers. Many went on to teach whole classes of future pilots. They would make sure that everyone had the opportunity to fly. Whether they could fly professionally or not, women who broke barriers wanted to make sure that others had the same opportunities, that they didn't have to face as many barriers as they did while learning to fly. We're going to get started with some of Illinois' great aviatrices. I think that's the plural. We're going to start with my favorite, my absolute favorite, Bessie Coleman. I love her. She's fantastic. Born in January of 1892 in Texas. She grew up in a large family. Her family were sharecroppers. She was African American and indigenous. There are varying reports as to what tribe her father belonged to, but she was African American and an indigenous woman. When she was in her late teens, early 20s, during the Great Migration, she moved up to Chicago and went to beauty school, became a manicurist at a barber shop. And when men started returning from World War I, she would hear all these stories about women flying in Europe. Her brothers would tease her that all these women in Europe could fly, but she couldn't. She desperately wanted to fly. She went around the country looking for a flight school. She went around asking everybody, and she was denied because she was a woman. She was denied because she was African American. Nobody would take her. But she did not stop. Bessie Coleman kept going. So while she lived in Chicago, she became friends with a man named Robert Abbott, who was the founder for the Chicago Defender, the first African-American newspaper in the United States. And he and another philanthropist in Chicago co-sponsored Coleman's tuition to France to get her license. Since she couldn't get her license here in the United States, she did go to France. She studied French for a year and then went off to France and took flight lessons. The initial school she was going to go to had closed. She got to France and found it was closed. There was a major accident and they were no longer accepting women into their class, so she had to go elsewhere. She went to the Caldron Brothers School of Aviation, and in 1921, she received her pilot's license. She came back to the United States as the first African-American woman and indigenous woman to receive a pilot's license. She was also the first woman in America to receive her international pilot's license. So she was among many firsts. Her dream was to open a flight school for African-Americans and African-American women specifically. She knew that flying was dangerous, and she wanted to be sure that in case of an accident, there was someone there who could take her place to teach future generations of pilots. There's a quote from Bessie Coleman that I absolutely love. "You have never lived until you've flown. The air is the only place free from prejudice." She toured the country, lecturing about being a pilot. She went around to inspire people as Harriet Quimby had inspired her and the women of France. She was a barnstormer. She did stunts. She did tricks in the air. And she refused to go places that segregated their attendance. There was a stadium in Texas that she went to that was going to have separate entrances for African Americans and for whites. And she said, "I refuse to perform here until you desegregate your entrance." And they did, because they wanted Coleman to be there. They wanted people to come to their venue. So she used her influence to make social changes. Bessie Coleman was unstoppable. She was amazing. I could go on about her forever. Unfortunately, she did crash her plane in 1923. It was her first crash. She cracked a few ribs. She broke her leg. Did not stop her. A few months later, she got back up, got back in her plane, and kept flying. 3 years after that, unfortunately, she was scouting an area where she was going to do an aerial show with her co-pilot. And the plane engine stopped suddenly and it flipped. She and her co-pilot were not buckled in properly, as they hadn't anticipated doing any stunts, and she was thrown from her plane and died on impact on the ground. It was a real loss. It was unfortunate that the major news outlets did not cover her death. Black newspapers did. African-American news outlets covered her death extensively, and Ida B. Wells came to Florida to perform the funeral service. Coleman died in Florida, and that's where her initial service was. She was then moved to Chicago and laid in state there, and there is a aviation club that does an annual flyover of her grave. So her memory has not disappeared. We want to make sure that Bessie Coleman is known throughout time. Here's Coleman with her first plane in 1922. She just loved to fly. It was her passion. Like I said, she would not take no for an answer. When she set her mind to something, she would work until she got to where she wanted to be. Our next woman is Willow Brown. She was born in January of 1906 in Kentucky. She attended Indiana State Teachers College in 1927. 10 years after that, she earned an MBA at Northwestern in 1937. She moved to Chicago, where she worked various jobs. She was a secretary, a social worker, a teacher. She did all sorts of different jobs. While she was working in Chicago, she met John C. Robinson, who introduced her to the Challenger Air Pilots Association, which was a group of African-American pilots. John C. Robinson was an activist and pilot. He opened an aviation school, and one of his branches turned into the Tuskegee Institute, or became the Tuskegee Institute. So he was a big name in aviation. She earned her master mechanic certification in 1935, and she gave flight and ground school instruction at Harlem Airfield in Chicago. She eventually went on to study at Curtis Wright Aeronautical University and received her pilot's license in 1938 and her commercial license in 1939. She is listed as the first African-American woman to be licensed in the U.S., but I will discuss this in a minute. I found some conflicting resources, so I will bring that up in a little bit. She is one of the co-founders of the National Airmen's Association of America, which was founded in 1939. It was also a group for African-American aviators. When World War II broke out, she tried to join the Wasp group, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, but was denied due to her race. She instead, with her husband, organized the Civil Air Patrol Squadron 613 in conjunction with his school, the Coffee School of Aeronautics. She held the rank of lieutenant and adjutant, and the CAP flew anti-submarine machines, border patrol, and courier services. So while she could not fly in a military capacity, she made sure that she had a part in what they were doing. Here's a picture of her when she was young with an airplane. She went on to be the director of the Coffee School and was directly responsible for training 200 future Tuskegee Airmen and instructors. So she was very influential in African-American flight world. She was determined to make sure that everyone could fly. Here she is with another pilot, Lola Albright. I could not find anything about her, but I'm going to assume it was a woman that perhaps Brown taught to fly. We have Janet Harman Fragg. She was born in March of 1907 in Georgia. She attended the Spelman College and qualified as a registered nurse in 1929. She was inspired by Bessie Coleman, which is great. Everyone's coming together, and also studied at the Curtis Wright School of Aeronautics. She was the only woman to enroll. There were 24 men in her class, and she was the only woman. This was a school that could not afford its own airplane. They didn't have access to a plane. So she took her money as a nurse and purchased a plane for the class. She made sure that her class had a plane because she wanted to learn. And if there's no plane, she can't learn. So she made sure to purchase the plane and was able to learn. She's the one who I found conflicting resources on for whether Willow Brown was the first woman to earn her license in the US. I found that Bragg earned her pilot's license, her regular pilot's license, in 1934, which is well before Willow Brown, which was 1938. Now, Brown is also listed as the first woman to receive her commercial license, which I absolutely will agree with this. She earned hers in 1939, and Bragg earned hers much later in 1942. So she was the first, perhaps the first one to earn her pilot's license, but not the first to earn her commercial license. Both stated that they were many resources stated that each one was the first one to receive their license and did not mention the other. So your guess is as good as mine. She wanted to learn to fly, keep flying. The local white airport owners, airfield owners would not grant her access to the airfield. So she and the local African-American community got together and held a class, helped the class establish an airfield and hangar. So she was still able to she and people like her were able to have access to flight places, to flight training. She did pass her commercial license test on the first go, but was denied because she was a woman. The instructor even said she did great. There's nothing wrong with what she did, but because she's a woman, I cannot give her a license. She too tried to join Wasp when World War II broke out, but was denied due to race. She did go on to train many students, many of whom went on to join the Wasp in World War II. She did retire from flying in 1965 with over 2,000 hours of flight hours, 2,000 flight hours logged. Some sources say that she flew for pleasure into the 1970s. Again, found conflicting reports. Regardless, she retired from flying relatively young and went on to continue to be a nurse and opened 2 nursing homes before she passed away in the 90s. Here's a photo of her in her flight suit. Then we have Neda Snook, who was the first one I could find born in Illinois. She was born in February of 1896 in Illinois. She was interested in mechanics from a very young age. Her father would set her on his lap when he was driving the car. They would operate farm machinery together. She liked to put things together and take them apart. She was very interested in mechanics from a young age. She attended Iowa State College, which is now Iowa State University, taking courses on mechanical drawing, engine, and farm machinery repair. So she went for machinery repair, for mechanics. She initially attended the Davenport Flying School because she was denied admission to Curtis Wright. But when a major accident killed the president of the school, the school was shut down and she had to find schooling elsewhere. But she did eventually attend Curtis Wright. She was the first woman to do so. She did so in 1917. I didn't do these in chronological order, so I'm going to jump around in time a little bit. When she did fly, civilian flight was banned in the U.S. during World War I, so she did have to take a little bit of a break from flying. But she did work for the British Air Ministry, inspecting and testing aircraft parts on their way to European combat in 1918. So while she couldn't fly, she did make sure she was working with airplanes. She did earn her license in 1918. She purchased a Canuck, which is the Canadian version of the Jenny plane, and rebuilt it in her parents' backyard in Iowa. When she received her license, she became a barnstormer and hauled passengers, even though her license did not allow her to do so. She did eventually move to California. Iowa winters not really conducive to flying, and she wanted to make sure she could fly all year round, so she moved to California, where she approached Bert Kenner, who owned an airfield, about being an instructor. And eventually, because she had the in with her mechanics knowledge and had all this previous knowledge of being of airfield mechanics, Kenner offered to let her run the airfield, and she's the first woman to operate a commercial airfield. She is most famously known for teaching Amelia Earhart. She was approached by Earhart, who said, "I want to fly. Will you teach me?" So for $1 in Liberty bonds per minute in the air, she taught Amelia Earhart how to fly. She became great friends with Amelia Earhart. That is what she is most known for. But she did give up flying for a marriage and a family. She did retire from flying. We have Bobby Trout. Bobby Trout, born in January of 1906 in Illinois. She began her aviation career at 16, but didn't earn her pilot's license until much later. She took her first plane ride after expressing interest in aviation in 1922, and she entered flight school, the Burdett Airline Inc. School of Aviation, in 1928. She was instructed to make a dangerous maneuver, a low altitude maneuver with a hard turn, and did unfortunately lose control of the plane and crashed, but that did not stop her. She continued to fly and eventually received her pilot's license and her solo certificate in 1928. She was an endurance flyer. She set records for the first all-night flight by a woman in 1929. And she broke the non-fueling endurance record for women twice. Once she broke the initial record, and then she broke her own record. So she broke the non-flight record with 17 hours. She was in the air for 17 hours. And then she broke a light aircraft altitude record in 1929. She was known as Bobby because of her short haircut. She kept it bobbed. And for Jean Hixon, I couldn't find a public domain photo of her, but she was born in September in 1922, also in Illinois. She received her pilot's license at age 18 in 1940. She served as a Wasp pilot during World War II. She was an engineering test pilot for B-25s. So she was well used to flying heavy machinery. After World War II, she became a flight instructor in Akron, and at night she attended Akron University, earning an education degree in about 1952. She was a teacher in Akron, but continued to fly, and she was the second woman to break the sound barrier. She was known as the Supersonic School Marm, which I think is a fun nickname. At age 37, she was invited to test at the Lovelace Center in Albuquerque, and she became part of what is known as the Mercury 13, which I will touch on in a little bit. There are women who succeeded in the first round of tests for a Mercury mission. After the program was terminated, she worked at the Flight Simulator Technique branch of the Air Force Reserve, and she retired from the Air Force Reserves as a full colonel in 1982. She completed 30 years of service in the Akron school system. So she did teach, and she taught children, and then she also flew and taught people to fly, helped train people to fly. So those are some important women from Illinois who broke barriers, who decided that the ground was not the place they wanted to be. They wanted to be in the sky above the clouds. So I did find some other things, more women who, while not from Illinois, were very important, very, very important to the story of women in aviation. So of course, we can't talk about women in aviation and not talk about Amelia Earhart. She set so many records in aviation. She was born in July of 1897 in Kansas, my apologies. While serving as a Red Cross nurse's aide in Toronto during World War I, she became inspired by the pilot she saw near where she was stationed. When World War I was over, she enrolled at Columbia University as a pre-med student, but she did take her first plane ride with a World War I pilot named Frank Hawks in 1920. He was a famed aviator, barnstormer. He was a spokesperson. He was a racer. He did everything. She really received her license and 2 days later participated in her first flight exhibition in 1921. And as I said, she set many aviation records. She was the first woman to fly solo above 14,000 feet in 1922. She was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1932. She just earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, the first woman to receive it for this solo flight. She was also the first solo nonstop flight across the US by a woman. She flew from LA to Newark in 1932. And she was the first person to fly solo from Hawaii to the mainland United States in 1935. She was one of the co-founders of the 99s, which is an organization of female pilots in 1929. She was the initial president. And she, in her second attempt to circumnavigate the globe, she did disappear in 1937. So she was last seen alive on July 2nd, taking off from a small island, and was never heard from again. Unfortunately, her story still ends in mystery. We still are unsure of where she is, where she ended up, and the story of Amelia Earhart, a great mystery to this day. An important woman, another record breaker, was Jacqueline Cochran. She was born in May of 1906 in Florida as Bessie Mae Pittman. It says in some sources that she was orphaned, but some sources say she just claimed to be, but kept in contact with the Pittman family. She did work as a hairstylist. She was very interested in beauty and cosmetics. She did receive her license after 3 weeks of flight lessons at Roosevelt Air Flight School in 1932. She pursued advanced instruction at Ryan's School of Aeronautics and received instrument rating, commercial and transport license in 1934. She established a beauty company in 1935 and was the person to fly across the country to deliver these products. These products were specifically designed to help with dry skin for flying at high altitudes. So not only was she interested in flying, she wanted to make sure that she looked great while she was doing it. So she had moisturizers and makeup and wanted to make sure that women flying at altitude, especially if you were flying in an open cockpit, had available resources available to make sure that your skin stayed nice. Like I said, she set a great many records. It's like a half page here that I have for records. She set 2 speed records, her first one in May at 652.5 miles per hour. And then she broke her own record in June, flying 670 miles an hour in 1952. She was the first woman to break the sound barrier in 1953. She was encouraged by Chuck Yeager, who was the first person to break the sound barrier. She set a series of altitude records, speed and distance records. I couldn't find these listed out, so I'm not quite sure what all they were, but that was in 1961. She was the first woman to take off and land from an aircraft carrier. Again, couldn't find a date for that. The first woman to pilot a bomber across the Atlantic in 1941. The first woman to fly a jet craft on a transatlantic flight. The first woman to make a blind instrument landing. The only woman to be the president of the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, that's the French International Flight Association. That is the institution that granted licenses. She's the president from 1958 to 1961. She was the first woman to fly a fixed wing jet across the Atlantic, the first pilot to fly over 20,000 feet, and the first woman to win the Bendy's Trophy in 1938. She was at it. She kept going. She never stopped. During World War II, she selected 27 women to ferry aircraft to Great Britain for the Air Transport Auxiliary in 1941. And she organized the Women's Flying Training Detachment in 1942. And with this information, with this knowledge that she had, she and another woman joined groups eventually and to form the Wasp, of which she was the director for a good while. She received the Distinguished Service Medal and 3 Distinguished Flying Cross awards. She was initially against the commission of female astronauts. I'll touch on this a little bit in the Mercury 13 section, and we're not quite sure why. Maybe she wanted to be the first one to fly in space. We'll never know. Here she is in her airplane. We had Hazel Ying Lee, born in August in 1912 in Oregon. Oh, I forgot to fill in the date there. She did receive her pilot's license in 1932. She was the first US-born Chinese-American woman to do so. She saved money from her job as an elevator operator to pay for flight lessons. And with financial help from the Portland Chinese Benevolent Society, she was able to receive her pilot's license. When Japan invaded Manchuria, she, like many other Chinese Americans, wanted to go back to China to help defend the land that their family came from. So she went to China, offered to be a pilot, but because she was a woman, she was given a desk job, and she was extremely unhappy about that. She wanted to fly. She was in China for a while. And this was in 1937, and she was in Canton when Japan bombed the city. So shortly after that, she returned to the United States. She was one of 2 Chinese pilots accepted to the Wasp program. She was the first to fly for the U.S. first Chinese American woman to fly for the U.S. military. There's a story of her falling from a plane, deploying her parachute, and walking back to base when she was working with the Wasp. She dragged her parachute all the way back to the base. She did unfortunately die while in service to Wasp. There was a miscommunication with the control tower, and another plane who was coming in crashed into hers, and she did perish 2 days later after this accident. This one was just a fun one. Pancho Barnes, real name Florence Lowe, born in California, July 1901. She was the granddaughter of Thaddeus Lowe, the creator of the Balloon Corps for the Army of the Potomac during the Civil War. She married an Episcopal priest. And the more I read about her, the more I was like, this was a choice that was certainly made. Pancho Barnes was not suited to be the wife of a pastor, of a priest. So in 1928, she did have a son, and in 1928 she left her husband and son to travel. She went down to Mexico dressed in men's clothes. Apparently, she worked for a gun runner. She worked on boats and earned the nickname Pancho. She liked to swear. She liked to drink. She liked to be bawdy. She was just out there. She did whatever she wanted. When she came back from the United States, she did aerial stunts for Hollywood. She did stunts for Hell's Angels in 1929, a Howard Hughes film. And she was helped found the Associated Motion Picture Stunt Pilot Union, because she fought to make sure that everyone had equal pay, and make sure that everyone was compensated for their time working in the film industry. Here she is with her plane in 1944. The Women's Air Derby was a race for women. Like I said, aerial racing was very, very popular. It would be cross country, it would just be speed, it could be a great number of things. So the first one was in 1929. Contestants needed 100 hours of flight time with a minimum of 25 cross country hours. This was overlooked for some people. And they also had to have a plane that was appropriate for women. So a woman named Opal Coons arrived in a plane that was a 300 horsepower. She flew there in this plane, but it was deemed too fast for a woman. So she had to find another plane to fly for this race. Despite the fact that she flew to this location, in the plane she was going to race in. Whatever. It went from Santa Monica, California to Cleveland, Ohio. This postcard here is from 1969. The race did continue. In 1929, there were 20 entrants. There was $25,000 of prize money on the line, and it was nicknamed by Will Rogers the Powder Puff Derby. Because when the women were getting ready to take off, they apparently powdered their noses, made sure to give themselves one last look in their compact before they took off. Phoebe Amelie got first in the light aircraft division, but first overall was Louise Thaden. Amelia Earhart was a participant in this race, as was Pancho Barnes. Got a picture here. Pancho's the one. She is this one right here. It's kind of in the middle. One woman did unfortunately die. There was a carbon monoxide leak in the cockpit of her plane, and she did crash. Marvel Crossan. They were thinking about canceling the race, but the contestants got together and decided that Marvel would want them to continue on, and so they kept on with the race. The 99s came out of this. It is named for the 99 charter members of the organization. It was a group for female pilots. It's still in existence today. And Amelia Earhart was the first pilot or first president of this organization. This race continued through the 30s. It paused for World War II. It was renewed in 1947, where it was renamed the All Women's Transcontinental Air Race. And then it eventually ended in 1977 and was replaced with the Air Race Classic Limited. Here's some of the contestants in 1948. Wasp were very important during World War II. It stands for Women Air Force Service Pilots. During World War II, Nancy Harkness Love and Jacqueline Cochran each had organizations of women pilots and lobbied to include female pilots in the war effort. Men were going off to war at great numbers, and so there weren't as many pilots, male pilots around to do essential jobs like ferrying planes, to moving equipment, those kinds of things. So the two programs, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron and the Women's Flying Training Detachment, operated separately until 1943. More than 25,000 women applied, but less than 10% of it were accepted. You had to be between 21 and 35. You had to have your commercial pilot's license and the ability to complete military training regimen. These women logged more than 60 million miles and flew everything that the Army Air Force had. They flew small craft, they flew jets. Anne Baumgartner became the first American woman to fly a jet in 1944 because they needed to test this jet. These women did a great many jobs. So not only did they ferry aircraft from bases across the country, they were trained in Stillwater, Texas, but were deployed across the country. So they ferried aircraft, they made test and demo flights, they served as instructors, and probably the most noteworthy is they towed targets for ground to air gunnery practice with live ammunition. This was very dangerous what these women did. They were considered part of the civil service, unlike the Women's Army Corps and the women accepted for volunteer emergency service, so the WACs and the WAVES. But this also meant for the 38 women who did die in service of WASP, they did not receive burial expenses or survivor benefits. So a lot of times the cost of sending a woman's body home fell to her fellow WASP. They would join together and make sure that she was able to be sent home. They were disbanded in 1944 and were all but forgotten. Finally, in 1977, by an order by Jimmy Carter, with the great push from Barry Goldwater, they were finally militarized and given veteran status. Barack Obama conferred congressional gold medals to all serving WASP in 2009. Very few were left to receive. I think about 200 were remaining left alive. but they did receive their license, and they finally have received the recognition that they deserve. These women did a great number of things. Here's Hazel Ying Lee, who I mentioned earlier, and Emma Jane Wyndham Burroughs, who was a great mechanic, did a lot of machinery work for the Wasp. Here are some trainees with their instructor. I found a film reel where they talk about women training for the Wasp program, and it's great because it really sets the tone for the time. It shows them learning mechanics and learning to fly and all the important things that go into being a pilot for Wasp. But they're also like, don't forget, they are beautiful ladies. Here they are tanning and making sure they still look like ladies. Here they are putting on makeup because they're ladies. And I'm like, all right, I get it. They are ladies, but they are also pilots doing an important job. So let's not forget that. Here's checking flight plan for a tow mission. These are the ones where they would tow targets for live ammo practice. Here they are checking the schedule. There are so many great images. I came across a woman who had a camera during her training, which was a no-no, but her father sent her color film. And so she would take all these photos, and you can see all these color images from her time training in Sweetwater, Texas. And some women received their training through the civilian pilot training program, but they did all learn to fly various aircrafts. And then last but not least, we have the Mercury 13. Mercury 13 was a group of women who tested to become astronauts, and 13 passed the first round of tests. They became the Mercury 13. So Dr. William Randolph Lovelace tested men for space programs, but he kind of got this idea in his head. He's like, well, you know, what if women tested to become pilots? So kind of in secret, is kind of an open secret, he also did these tests on women. The women who qualified were known as flats, First Lady Astronaut Trainees. I think it's a funny title. Women were not tested as a group, and they were not included in any NASA program. This was not government sanctioned. There was no government sanctioned program for women to become pilots. The tests began in 1960, started with Geraldine Cobb, Jerry Cobb, she's pictured here. And then after the initial round of tests, which was stage one was physical tests and exams. So they did x-rays. For some reason, they needed a gynecological exam. They did EKGs, EEGs, neurological tests, pulmonary tests, O2 capacity. I mean, they tested the crap out of these women. 13 women passed the initial test. So we had Myrtle Cagle, Janet Dietrich, Marion Dietrich, Wally Funk, Sarah Gorlick, Jane Biggs Hart, Jean Hixon, who I mentioned earlier, Ray Woltman, Jean Nora Strombo, Irene Leverton, Jerry Sloan, and Beatrice Stedman. The second round of tests was psychological screenings, personality tests, neurological tests, isolation tests, those kinds of things. All women completed phase 1, 3 completed phase 2, and only 1, Jerry Cobb, completed phase 3. And the reason the numbers are so off is because the women could not be tested as a group, and they couldn't even be tested back to back, because Lovelace was doing this on his own time. He was doing this kind of in secret, so he would kind of have to do them when he could around training other men. The great thing about Jerry Cobb that I found was that she scored in the top 2% of all candidates across genders. So she even scored better than some of the men who flew in the Mercury mission. So when you say women can't do things, you better watch out, because Jerry Cobb will come and blow you all away. The Flats was canceled. The Flats program was canceled, not due to lack of funding, but due to lack of training facilities, testing facilities. Since this wasn't a government initiated program, and NASA had no intention and no interest in sending women to space, Lovelace could not get access to government facilities to train these women. After it was canceled, Jerry Cobb campaigned for a congressional hearing about women becoming pilots or astronauts in 1962. Jacqueline Cochran was part of this congressional hearing. She was the final nail in the coffin for women becoming astronauts for a good long while. Again, like I said, no one's really sure why, especially being such a groundbreaking aviator as she was. But that was her decision. So that's where we're at. Wally Funk, one of the 13, did eventually go into space. She is the oldest woman to go into space. She flew on the Blue Origin's New Horizon in 2021. At the time, she was the oldest person who went into space, but she was superseded by William Shatner the following year, and he was 90 years old. So in conclusion, women have been breaking barriers in the sky as long as there have been planes. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the Q&A box. I would be glad to answer any questions that you have. We have a question, how did the animals get back down? They didn't. They would test them. If the flight was successful, especially with hot air balloons, the balloon would eventually lower because the heat in the bag would escape and they would lower back to the ground. But kind of like with Leica, the first dog in space, they used animals because they didn't really anticipate them coming back down. A tragic story for animals in flight. So we have a comment here about the Wright sibling who graduated college should get some credit for running the bike shop while the boys were planning their working with their airplanes. And she did media work for them before they got off the ground. Thank you, Douglas. I did not know that. I was focused very much on the plane aspect. This is good to know. I have a question as to what I believed happened to Amelia Earhart. I don't think it's glamorous or conspiratorial. I think she and her co-pilot may have veered off course a little bit and crashed into the ocean. I know that they've done searches. There are currents in the ocean that possibly moved things, but I think it's just they had a mechanical failure. They encountered a storm and just crashed into the ocean and were never seen again. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.